So here you're seeing Melissa's logic model for a program that she's evaluating, and this is where this program is occurring at UW Health. And the program involves an intervention for people who are screened as drinking more alcohol than is appropriate. And so it's an intervention to address that. So here I'd like to focus on these program activities. Obviously here's the screening, which is intended to identify these patients who are either at moderate or high risk for drinking more alcohol than they should. And then you see these components of delivering this program. You'll notice that these outputs are pretty generic in terms of who they want to reach. If this were a classic pulled back evaluation, you would want to understand how many of these patients and families and organizations are being reached. So you'd want to count these things and actually evaluate this. This isn't appropriate for her intervention because she is only focusing on those patients who have chosen to have this intervention. So even if someone screens to have a high risk, it is the patient's choice as to whether they want that intervention. So that's what she is focusing on. In this case, it will be appropriate for her to identify how many people were screened, and of those who were screened, how many chose to participate in this intervention, and furthermore, the ability to be able to assess whether they all got the full dose of this intervention or whether some of them may have dropped out would also be important elements to try to incorporate into her evaluation. So let's take a look at these outcomes. These are classic psychological outcomes of whether this intervention changes how people think and the knowledge they have. Change in behavior would likely, we see that over here. So I would, generally these short term are these psychological kind of in the head outcomes that can be measured with a survey or with a questionnaire or through interviews. Here we're seeing these medium outcomes that are really aimed at changing behavior. And I think it's appropriate to include these intentions to change. Who do they intend to change their behavior? Because intentions are thought of as more tightly linked to behavior change, even though they're still a psychological variable. You can think of intentions as maybe being somewhat linked to motivations. Motivations is probably a term that's more consistent with how this intervention is intended to work. And then we have these long-term health outcomes and this goal of decreasing risk. The last thing I'd like to point out here is that she summarized the logic of how the intervention is intended to work. She's in the process of choosing a model, but this model that she chooses, this model or theory, will need to fit with what she is measuring. And then this is also this logic of how screening would be intended to be associated with outcomes. So you are not required to have a logic model for your scholarly project in this course, but when you do develop your capstone, you will want to include this logic model, and it will be very important to lay out this theory of cause and effect for what you're doing. Here we're seeing Kim's logic model, and this was a logic model that she developed for a grant application with a goal of creating a culture of health at Edgewood College. And she listed these multiple activities that would contribute to creating this culture of health. So as you can imagine, for a grant application, this would not only look impressive, but it would be impressive to think about the need for these multiple types of programs and activities, because creating a culture of health is a big thing. It's not some smaller intervention. So let's take a look at what we're seeing here. We have these components that are described really at this broad topic level, which is fine for this type of a application. As I mentioned, we're seeing these many activities that are each, some of them are programs, some of them interventions, but collectively they have this intent of creating this culture of health. In our output column, we have some of these as these more classic outcomes that we talked about earlier, number of students with insurance or accessing health services, so we've talked about these earlier. And then some of these are actually short-term outcomes, these psychological outcomes that we see here. Some of these are more counts, number of daily meals, that would probably be an outcome. So we kind of see a mix of short-term outcomes and outputs, which is fine in this application. And then we see these outcomes and long-term outcomes. I think what I would like to point out here is that the success of this culture of health endeavor would require that each of these individual programs or interventions were successful, or at least that a critical mass of these were effective, and that it would be beneficial to create a logic model for each and every one of these when these are rolling out on the ground, to ensure that to ensure two things. One, that you have good measures, and you can see as a lot of these measures have been thought out very well. But the other is to think about evaluating the process part of this. So let's just look at one example. So if you have this physical sleep environmental program, how many students are participating in that? And if they sign up to participate, do they actually participate? How many go through the interventions and get an appropriate dose of this program that would allow us to see, if we look at these scores and how these scores are increasing, whether we see differences across. We would need to screen out those who actually participated in the program, not just those who signed up. And we'd need to also, it would be helpful to know the dose of the program that they got, because it would tell us more about those scores. So I think it kind of illustrates that these logic models at this specific level allow you to open that black box and see how they're working, which for these large endeavors can be very important for ensuring the success of your big goals.